This is some pretty high-end philosophy, but hopefully I have made it clear enough that you can follow along with me. This is called Patanjali's Tough Love. It is likely that you and I will agree that the mind exists. And generally, we think of ourselves as either A, living as the mind, even if you think it's an illusion, or B, living in the mind, as if you are an entity, but you live inside of a mind. But due to differing beliefs regarding the existence of the self, the eternal spiritual self, we cannot all agree that there is a self existing, either conscious or unconscious of itself inside of the mind container. And despite the duality of Dvaita and Advaita, two Sanskrit words that are opposing, one means duality, multiplicity, and the other one, Advaita, means oneness. So Dvaita means two, Advaita means not two. So Dvaita means that there are multiple entities in the creation and multiple things and multiple entities. Advaita means that it's all one. It's all the same thing. And any concept of diversity is an illusion. So this is the argument that has been debated by the greatest minds since the beginning. And so despite the duality of these two philosophies, I would bet that we can also agree that the individual mind is a psychic container full of contents which psychically control the physical body while embodying it. And when the physical body is no longer functional due to old age or disease or injury, the mind exits the physical form, yet remains the mind, right? It remains a container full of psychic organs, which cause it to function in this realm, both the physical realm when it has a physical format, as well as any astral formats that it's compatible with and finds itself in. Most of us are aware and agree that we go back and forth between this physical world and the astral world through a process called reincarnation. But is this existence simply explained away as an automatic pilot situation where the great Brahman, the great everything, is making believe that it is multiple beings and multiple things? And the game is to bring all of those parts, those divided parts, which we would be categorized as those divided parts in our phony, illusory existence, back into this all-inclusive state of oneness. Or we could call it, instead of oneness, we could call it nothing elseness, since the idea is that there is just one thing really in existence. That lonely condition of that one being supposedly caused itself to diversify itself, to make believe that it was other things. And the game is to bring all of those things back to that lonely state again. That's an interesting philosophy. There are many forms of meditation that promote relaxation and engagement of the visualization component of the mind, meant to take itself, the mind, to a more pleasant, albeit make-believe place than the one it currently finds itself in. You know the places the guided meditation teachers will take you: a heavenly flower garden, a crystal beach, a quiet forest. The mind can conjure up better places to pretend it exists in than the one that it actually finds itself in. But is that all it can do? Pretend? to imagine itself as something that is somewhere better than it really is? Patanjali didn't seem to think so. He thought that the little self, the little individual soul, could get along without imagination, without visualization, without memories. He seemed to think that the spiritual self had things to do and people to see beyond what the local mental tools were able to perceive. He required us to put down those local mental tools if we were to attempt to experience any non-local things. So what did Patanjali want for us? In not supporting the primitive idea of Advaita or oneness, he instructed that we stop making believe anything during meditation and to give up the vrittis. The vrittis, we find that word in the second verse of the first chapter of the Yoga Sutras. The vrittis are the fluctuations of the mind, the tendency for the mind to think about things, to analyze things, to perceive things, to remember things, to imagine things. He demands the stabilization and sublimation of mental activities for the sake of what? For Patanjali, it was for the sake of the perceiver. In Sanskrit, we call it the swarup, or the Atma. Why does Patanjali bring up this swarup? And why does it matter? To Patanjali, the individual mattered most in much the same way that Lord Krishna thought that it mattered when he reminded the warrior Arjuna so sternly on the battlefield that the individual soul is, was, and will always be. Patanjali thought the self mattered so much that he was willing to leave it with nothing to relate to on the local level, the level on which it currently depends. He was willing for you and I to be left alone. Why? Because it seems like torture for anyone who relates so strongly to the mind to do that, doesn't it? Seems like trauma for one who believes that they are the mind, and if not the mind, then a nothing, an illusion to themselves. Seems like a torturous request for the one who doesn't believe that there is even a self in there to redeem. Because if there is not a self to redeem, there is no one to experience the bliss of self-realization, of spiritual self-love, and of one's relationship with Ishwara. We find that word in the Yoga Sutras too. It means the supreme person. The very person Lord Krishna claimed himself to be. And you can forget about experiencing any of those things if there is no self. Patanjali requires that we sacrifice the addiction to the relationship we have with our mind. Just as when an alcoholic gives up the drink and begins the process of sobering up, he or she can feel boring, lifeless, personalityless, underdeveloped, no fun. But once the alcohol leaves the system, he may awaken to himself, a self he knew previous to the drink or that he had never known before. He may begin to value this real person, this sober person, the person not under the influence. When Patanjali asks us to leave behind the drug of imagination, he asks us to sober up spiritually. Through this act of tough love, the self is given the chance to awaken, to realize its own personal relationship, its glorious relationship with God, and to plan for its future, whatever that may be. thinking ahead, looking ahead, accepting that the self exists and that it has a life. And its only life isn't just here on these physical material planes that redundantly recycle us, regurgitate us, reincarnate us. But ascension is possible if we believe in the self. If we don't, what is there to work with? What is there to do? So Patanjali wanted us to discover this Swarup, this Atma. How? By shutting down the vrittis. By lifting our energies up to higher concentration forces to attach ourselves to connect ourselves to during meditation and outside of meditation and just our living. So yoga is an action of tough love, but it's very well worth it in the end.